Good evening and welcome to the History and Heritage Lecture Series at University College Isle of Man. Our speaker this evening is going to be familiar to many of you. Dr. Mike Hoy is a lecturer on our International History and Heritage degree here at University College Isle of Man, and until his retirement in 2003, he was Head of English and Drama at King William's College. Now, after retirement, he undertook a PhD with the University of Liverpool, looking at the development of education and literacy on the island in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, if any of you are looking for some Christmas presents for that hard-to-buy-for person in your life, I can also tell you that Dr. Mike Hoy is the author of 2 books on the history of King William's College and its foundation charities, available in all good man's bookshops, as well as a number of academic articles. Now, he's currently undertaking research into the early modern social history of the island for the universities of Huddersfield and Liverpool, as well as co-editing Volume 4 of the University of Liverpool's New History of the Isle of Man. This evening, Dr. Hoy is going to be speaking about another of his current areas of research, women's suffrage on the Isle of Man and the role of women in Manchester politics.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Good evening. In 1991, I went on holiday to Czechoslovakia. Just 2 years before that, the Iron Curtain had come down across Eastern Europe, and that was a fascinating time to be travelling in a country which was discovering again the opportunities and the responsibilities of democracy, building a new civil society. There weren't any neon lights in Wenceslas Square, but Prague was vibrant with expectations of a new world order. There were people walking the streets with their heads buried in books because for the first time they could choose what they read and not have it dictated to them. There were student entrepreneurs who were setting up little pavement cafes who sat on a beer crate. And on one of our day tours by coach, we were in the middle of Ostrava, and there was an unscheduled stop. Our wonderful courier, who was an elderly, cultured lady who'd learned English by reading Shakespeare and by listening secretly to the BBC World Service, explained to those of us on the coach, "I hope you will excuse this unscheduled stop. The driver and I are going to do something we haven't been able to do for most of our lives. We're going to vote. And we take our right to vote for granted. And it's a precious right, and we should treasure it, and we should use it." Well, on the 31st of January 1881, women in the Isle of Man who owned property in their own right were given the vote. And it's one of our proudest boasts that the Court of Tynwald was the first jurisdiction in the world to enfranchise women. The House of Keys debated franchise reform on the 5th of November 1880. The legislation proposed by Governor Locke was to extend the vote to leaseholders and lodgers and to change the geography of the 24 seats. There wasn't any hint at all of the extension of the vote to women, that might be proposed. So it was that in the chamber things took an unexpected turn. Robert Farger's radical Mona's Herald reported everything that went on in that debate with relish. And the reformist lead in the debate was taken by Richard Sherwood, who who was MHK for Glenfaven. And he argued that since as a principle of justice, taxation and representation should go together, the word male should be removed from the proposed legislation. Furthermore, he named a number of ladies well known to members in Manx society who were, he contended, much more deserving of enfranchisement than many of the male householders. Somewhat contentious, and this is what he said: household suffrage will be given to all men in towns, no matter what their intellectual capabilities might be, while at the same time such ladies as Mrs. Hall, Mrs. Gorn, Miss Clucas, Mrs. Hogg, and other ladies of culture and intelligence will be denied the right to vote. Just imagine something like that being said today in the Chamber. If the Keys found that they had taken a step too far, the feminine view becoming an embarrassment, then Edward Farrant advocated the simplest of measures to stop them in their tracks. This was his argument. If, in the working of this, the women are found to be a nuisance, there is one way of disenfranchising them, which I would recommend to the House, and particularly to the bachelors of this island. Because, of course, as married women, they would then no longer have an independent voice. The Keys proposed not only the enfranchisement of women, but also that they should be eligible for election to the Keys to become members. And so confident was Richard Sherwood that the reformers would carry the House that he suggested only one light-hearted objection. Some larger seats would have to be Edward Farrant capped it by observing, to roars of laughter, that to admit ladies as members of the House of Keys would, at all events, be putting representation on a broader basis. When the vote was called, the Keys carried the historic proposition by 16 to 3, and success seemed assured. But the reform proposed was too radical for Governor Locke, who was unwilling to set Tynwald at odds with Westminster. And his council forced an amendment which restricted the vote to spinsters and widows who owned property in their own right. The Isle of Man Times angrily denounced this interference by what it called a collection of paid Crown officials. But there was a general election pending, and Sherwood and his supporters very reluctantly agreed to accept Governor Locke's convention. But they insisted that the Keys' advocacy of the principle of absolute parity of male and female suffrage should be recorded. So, single women eligible by ownership of property were enfranchised here in the Isle of Man 37 years before the Westminster Parliament got round to it in 1918. The Isle of Man Franchise Act of 1881 brings to mind customary rights which women had enjoyed here in the time of the Kingdom of Man and the Isles in the 10th and 11th centuries, when the Isle of Man was part of a Norse diaspora which stretched from Norway into the Irish Sea, out across the North Atlantic to the Faroe Islands and Iceland. Women in Viking Age Scandinavia could own property. They usually had a say in drawing up their marriage contracts, and they could request a divorce and reclaim their dowries if the marriage ended. Although the man was officially the head of the household, Norse women had full domestic authority in their households, and they managed everything by right when their husbands were absent. If the husband died, his wife legally assumed the role on a permanent basis and single-handedly run the family farm or the trading business. Now, many women in Viking Age Scandinavia were buried with rings of keys. And that symbolized their roles and the powers they had as household managers. Their resilience, their resourcefulness, their independent social status is very well represented in sagas and other literature. And in particular by Aud, A-U-D, Aud the Deep-Minded, who was the daughter of a Norwegian Hebridean chieftain. And in the late 9th century, when her husband and her son died, she uprooted her household. She herself organized a ship voyage for herself and her grandchildren to Iceland, and there she became one of the colony's most important settlers. Here, in the Isle of Man, grave goods of the pagan Lady of Peel, with which you'll all be familiar, reminds us of the high status of women in the Scandinavian tradition. There are two graves in Orkney of particular interest. One of a young, wealthy mother with newborn twins in Westmass, and another of an elderly matriarch from Skar. Both of these show similar signs, symbols of status. And there's compelling evidence too if you look at the Manx crosses. More than a quarter of those commemorate women. By the time we get to the early 15th century, the independence and parity of status which women had enjoyed in the Isle of Man as part of their Norse heritage was less secure, at least in legal and administrative documents. And after the lordship passed to the Stanleys in 1405, we find that the island's statutes begin to reflect the influence of English and continental law as opposed to Scandinavian law. Some examples. It was the worthiest men in the land who were to appear before the Deemsters at first Stanley Tynwald in 1417. No women were named among the 6 men of each reading chosen by the whole Commons. In 1504, an inquest of Lord's officers and the keys ruled this: if any forfeit his goods to the Lord by felony, his wife shall not forfeit her part of goods, because the woman is but subject and obedient to the man. But that's the change in law. Outside the context of the law, the old Scandinavian traditions of women's parity of status survived. And there's some remarkable evidence of this at the end of the 17th century, which we'll have a look at a little later. Scandinavian law is full of stories about women who challenged their male counterparts and took on tasks themselves rather than leaving them to men. And in some cases, this even led to women becoming warriors, and that despite the fact that there is no feminine form of the Norse word vikingar, from which we get Viking. In everyday life, among high and low in society, it seems that it was expected that women would go beyond customary social expectations, and there is no more striking evidence of this transfer of power than the achievements of Margaret Valdemarsdottir. She was the consort of Håkon VI of Norway, and she founded the Kalmar Union. And that's the United Kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, which lasted for a considerable time. If we now jump to the second half of the 19th century, back to the debate and the legislation in Tynwald, well, at that time, we find that Scandinavian women are once again taking a lead in promoting social reform elsewhere. The first women's organisation, Iceland, was founded in 1869 to promote unity and cooperation among women right across Iceland. And although at that stage there isn't any mention of civil or political rights in its foundation documents, it seems that this society in Iceland and other similar women's self-help societies there influenced the Althing, the Icelandic parliament, to discuss eventually extending the franchise to women. And that was brought up on a number of occasions. In 1894, the Icelandic Women's Association was founded to promote votes for women. But although most parliamentarians supported the society's aims, it wasn't in fact until 1920, and that was the date in which Iceland became a sovereign state, independent of Denmark. It wasn't until then that the Icelandic suffragette Britt Bjarnhéðinsdóttir achieved the goal of full women's suffrage in 1920. In Norway, the movement for women's emancipation began even later, following the extension of suffrage to all men in Norway in 1898. Norwegian women were outraged that they were excluded from the legislation in 1898, and within just a few weeks, the National Association for Women's Suffrage was founded in Oslo by Gina Krog, and she was a friend of the British suffragette Millicent Fawcett. Her campaign was supported by members of the Storting, the Norwegian Parliament, but it wasn't until 1913, 8 years after Norway won its independence from Sweden, that Norwegian women won the right to vote. In Copenhagen, in 1889, Lena Leplau founded the women's suffrage movement and led a vigorous campaign which succeeded in improving social conditions for Danish women, but they had to wait until 1915 before they gained the vote. Adding up all these dates, you'll see where it's leading. The first Scandinavian country actually to give the vote to women was the Grand Duchy of Finland in 1906. It was a landmark reform which was very much at the heart of Finland's struggle for independence against Russia, which of course they won 100 years ago last Wednesday. So franchise reform in all these Scandinavian countries was delayed because it became tangled up with the struggle for independence, which embroiled all of them at the end of the 19th century. So, the first country with a Norse heritage which gave the vote to women, albeit with a property qualification, was Iceland, Norway, Denmark, or Finland, but the Isle of Man. And with their rights to property, inheritance, divorce, Norse women had more rights than anywhere else in Europe in the early Middle Ages. In 1881, those rights were in part confirmed again in Tynwald's Isle of Man Franchise Act. But of course, as you know, there is another claim to the distinction of being the first country to give the vote to women. In 1880, James Wallace, who was a member of the New Zealand Parliament, tried to bring in legislation to enfranchise women. He withdrew his bill when opponents tried to impose a property qualification. But the momentum for change had begun. A 12-year campaign followed. It was led by Kate Shepherd, and it culminated in the presentation to Parliament in Wellington of an extraordinary petition. It was 270 metres long, and it contained 25,520 signatures. There's the start of it, and my arrow shows you Kate Shepherd's signature. This led directly to the New Zealand Electoral Act, 1893, and whereas Richard Sherwood's vision of parity of suffrage in the Isle of Man had been compromised, whether by temerity or by design, by the Governor's Council, New Zealand's Parliament is just one chamber. It still is, only one chamber, and they had no need to look over their shoulders, and they secured from the outset equal rights for all women without qualification of property. It was a long and well-organised campaign in New Zealand. It had the support of the Prime Minister, Sir John Hall. It seems at first sight to be very different from the way that things happened here. Back to the record, to extract the record of the debate. Richard Sherwood's proposal in the Keys debate to strike out the word male in the new legislation has the appearance of being a spur-of-the-moment decision. But playing the whole reform process low-key seems to me to have been a deliberate strategy. And Robert Fison has looked at this, and if you've read his excellent book, The Struggle for Manx Democracy, you'll have read his views there. Sherwood's campaign had actually begun 5 years earlier in 1875, and there had already been an attempt to promote women's suffrage. Apart from that, when 46 inhabitants of Douglas submitted a petition to the House of Commons in 1873. 7 years before that, 1866, when the island's first franchise reform bill made the House of Keys an elected legislature, the Isle of Man Times reported of the campaign in Douglas. The fair sex seemed to take quite as much interest in the contest as the males did, many hundreds of ladies sporting their favourite colours of either red or blue. Of course, they couldn't vote, but their engagement with the electoral process led one supporter of women's franchise, J.J. Lockhart, to claim that island women would make very good senators, in other words, elected members of the Keys. In the summer of 1880, the Manx press carried notices of 5 meetings to be addressed by Lydia Becker and Alice Scatcherd of the National Association for the Promotion of Women's Suffrage, which was based in Manchester. Lydia Becker, as many of you will know, was of course a leading figure in the early British suffrage movement. She campaigned for radical social reform, especially championing scientific education for the girls, and in 1868 she addressed the first public meeting for the National Society for Women's Suffrage in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. 2 years later, she founded and began publication of the Women's Suffrage Journal, and for the next 20 years that was the main mouthpiece for the campaign for franchise reform. Lydia Becker's visit to the island attracted extraordinary interest. Halls were packed to hear her, and the majority of those who attended were women. The Mona's Herald reported on the audience at the first Douglas meeting. The majority of those present were ladies of the better class, not a few of whom had a grievance in the shape of being taxpayers without suffrage in the election of members to our insular House of Parliament. The mood in Manx society was now very different from what it had been a decade ago. And furthermore, all 4 of the island's newspapers were now in favour of women's franchise. The sole bastion of conservative opinion, the Manx Sun, had come on board the reform movement in 1880 when Harriet Curfew succeeded her husband as owner and editor. And in her editorial on the 30th of October 1880, she advocated female suffrage as the best way to promote social reform and introduce good and wholesome measures to improve living conditions for the island's poor and disadvantaged. Well, here there were no giant petitions to Tynwald, but Lydia Becker's impact on Manx society was considerable, and Harriet Curfew's part is worth some further investigation and research. She certainly encouraged women to engage in the public debate. Richard Sherwood took advantage of all this. He was right in calculating that he had overwhelming support when he introduced his reform into the Keys. In the Keys debate, in November 1880, Richard Sherwood referred to the 4 women by name I mentioned earlier: Mrs. Hall, Mrs. Gorn, Miss Clucas, and Mrs. Hogg. He called them women of culture and intelligence, and he considered them to be far more worthy of enfranchisement than many of his male contemporaries. Well, who were they? 2 of them, Mrs. Hall and Mrs. Gorn, were indeed among the most well-known of all island women at the time. Frances Hall came originally from the Irish landed gentry and was married to the island's archdeacon and widowed at a relatively young age. And subsequently, for more than 40 years, Frances Hall was one of the island's leading philanthropic benefactors. She contributed, among other projects, to the building of St Matthew's Church and the establishment of Douglas Grammar School. Emily Gaughan of Kentrell, who'd been married to Edward Gaughan, who was the last Speaker of the unelected Keys, and she too was much respected for her charitable work. A.W. Moore called her a true Lady Bountiful. She set up poor relief for victims of the potato famine in the 1840s. She established a benefit society in Russia. She built a new church in Port St Mary. And particularly interesting was the fact that at a time when there wasn't any civic public financing for girls' education, she set up the parish girls' school in Russia. I think we can assume that Frances Hall and Emily Gaughan were in the audience for at least one of Lydia Becker's public meetings. This is an interesting observation. Their attendance isn't recorded. The attendance of any women would not actually be recorded because they did not speak, not one of them. And it seems that their engagement in the reform debate was quietly restrained, though no less influential than the louder voices of the men of the island. And that must be quite a fascinating contrast to the evidence which we've had a look at from the other side of the world, where the women were engaged in this extraordinary movement for reform in New Zealand. The House of Keys Election Act in 1881 enfranchised over 700 Manx women. That's up to 10% of the electorate. And the first woman to vote was Esther Key of Andreas. She is, and here, and here. Lydia Becker and the Manchester Society championed this reform as a great victory and a triumphant vindication of the principle of equality of the sexes. And they went on to express the hope that the House of Commons will not be more narrow in its view of the true basis of popular representation than its sister assembly, the House of Keys. 11 years later, the island's reformers succeeded in extending the vote to women leaseholders, and the property qualification was fully lifted in 1908. In the United Kingdom, we're still waiting. Another 20 years before they could vote without any property qualification at all. One of those pictures, I'm sure you will recognise. In view of the pioneering vision that we've explored on opposite sides of the world, here and in New Zealand, it's quite ironic that Nancy Astor was the first woman to be elected to Parliament in Westminster in 1919, 1 year after the belated extension of the franchise to women of property in the United Kingdom. And the Isle of Man and New Zealand both had to wait until 1933 for their first female members of Parliament, and both are in the same year. Marion Shimmin here in House of Keys, and Elizabeth McCombs in Wellington. They're both fascinating characters. They are both social democrats, both members of the Labour parties in their respective jurisdictions. They both were champions of children's rights, of women's rights, and of labour rights. Marion Shimmin served as MHK for Peel until her death in 1942, and she campaigned tirelessly to improve conditions and support for the less well-off in the community. She served on Tynwald committees, boards of health, insurance, pensions, and fishing. And one of her key achievements was to secure in the Keys legislation to give financial aid and support to fishermen in what at that time, of course, was a much, much bigger industry than it is today. She was a school teacher and she came from Cheshire, came here to teach and met and married Peter Shimmin. Peel City Guardian described her as, wait for it, a most intelligent and capable lady, if anything above the average standard of members of the present House. Her obituary said that her greatest concern was to do the best she could for humanity in general. A remarkable lady. She needs a biography. Great story. So, there, with honours even, other side of the world, here the case rests. Or does it? Well, when Bishop Wilson arrived in 1698, he found the diocese here in crisis. For more than a century, the Stanleys, as lords of the Isle, had insisted that the old Scandinavian tradition of the tenure of straw, whereby a land lease could be passed at will from father to son, or daughter, or wife, was void. The disaffection that this aroused was probably something the Stanleys could live with, but the consequences for island life were far-reaching. By the end of the 17th century, whole tracts of land here in the island lay abandoned because the enterprising Manx, fed up with the uncertainties of entitlement to leasehold, you're not going to bother to improve or look after your land if you don't know who it's going to go to. They turned instead, with striking success, of course, to burgeoning running trade, smuggling. William Stanley, the 9th Earl of Derby, asked Bishop Wilson to consider how regulation of the island's leases might be reformed. And Wilson was very concerned to carry the people with him in any proposals for change, and he summoned every leaseholder in the island to assemble by parish to elect a sheading representative to attend Tynwald's deliberations on land reform. And most of the voting returns, which of course are in the Island National Archive, record a summary of proceedings. But the returns for the sheadings of Garth and German, which of course comprises Peel and Ramsey, 4 of the island's 17 parishes, contain marks and signatures of every voter, every name. Listed among the leaseholders of the parishes of Longan and Macclesfield are 4 women: Jane Allen, Margaret Collister, Joni Cottiman and Margaret Camping. Now in Wales, 1696, the rest of Britain 30 years later, the customary protection of the property rights of women and minors was abolished by statute. But there was no such legislation here. And in accordance with the old Scandinavian traditions, the equality of women before the law, they were entitled as leaseholders to the same rights as men, including the right to vote. So in fact, the situation of these 4 women in 1700 was the same as that of Mrs. Hall, Mrs. Gorn and Mrs. Park. They're widowed ladies. Well, who were they? Jane Allen, Margaret Collister and Joni Cottiman of Macclesfield and Margaret Cowan of London. They were widows of Portland farmers, and they held their leases in their own right, as their women forebears had done back in the 10th century in the Norse Kingdom. 2 of them, Jane Allen and Joni Cottiman, may be traced in the islands of Macclesfield. Jane Allen died in 1702. Her will gives some clues as to who she was and what her life was like. Now, Macclesfield's best land is good arable pasture. Inland rises up to North Brule, where hefted sheep can roam. The average size of a Mac's quarterland farm in the 17th and 18th century was 90 acres, and typically comprised both pasture and arable. And among Jane Allen's bequests were 3 dairy cows and 1 heifer to her children and grandchildren. To her grandchildren, all my sheep in their fold, or with their sheep daily pasturing. To her daughters Elizabeth and Catherine, 20 shillings apiece, to buy each of them a mourning ring. To her grandsons Francis and John, 5 shillings apiece legacy. To my son Francis, 4 guineas. Mindful of a duty of care to those less fortunate, she bequeathed 3 fields of barley to the neediest poor of the parish. Jane Allen was a woman of some substance. Her farm must clearly have been well ordered and productive. She's an efficient leaseholder of the Lord's land. She held it in her own right, and she could vote. Joni Cottiman's will may be one of a number that cannot be identified in a damaged folio in the National Archive. But her Portland farm is recorded in the manorial rent lists. Here it is. She held the lease of Ballagillia, one of the 4 farms in the Treen division of Ballagillia, in the parish of Macclesfield, with a rent of 32 shillings. She shared the lease with other members of her extended family, and she paid 10 shillings and 4pence, the highest portion of the rent for the largest share of the land. She voted in 1700 as a widow, but she's actually now married again to John Costain. Significantly, you'll see that her name comes before his. The system of land division, devised by Thomas Stanley early in the 16th century, had changed very little by the time we got to the Manx Act of Settlement in 1703. And it's possible to work out from the tree maps prepared in 1930 by William Coven the most likely location of her farm. Quarterland, named Ballagillia in 1513, borders poor intact land, but the rent that Joni Cotterman paid isn't the lowest in the tree, and it seems much more likely, we can't know for sure, but it seems more likely that the area that's actually named for Cottingham is indeed the farm that she leased. And if that was Joni Cotterman's farm, much of it was good land. James Woods surveyed the island, of course, with the First Ordnance Survey map, and he records land use there is mostly arable. And the bequests that Joni Cotterman would have made in her will would no doubt have been similar to Jane Allen's. And it must be unlikely that Jane Allen, Margaret Collister, Joni Cotterman, and Margaret Cowan were the only women who voted in 1700. Their entitlement as leaseholders in their own right is reflected also in other responsibilities that women had. They could be convened as members of juries of matrons, for example. There's a record in 1682 of Anne Quayle of Patrick being appointed Moor, that is, collector of the land income. So 181 years later, 1881, the House of Keys Election Act enfranchised over 700 Manx women. Lydia Becker maintained close links with the island. She encouraged women to exercise their right to vote. She wrote, "Enfranchisement of women means not simply the addition of so many more names to the electoral roll, but the infusion into political life of those higher moral and spiritual influences which it is the mission of women to diffuse in family and social life." But the Isle of Man and New Zealand can both take pride in their remarkable pioneering contributions to democratic reform. But that is not quite the end of the story. There is another jurisdiction, albeit not at the time of a sovereign country, which has a claim to a place in the story of the enfranchisement of women. And it has unexpected links with the Isle of Man. The first place in the world to grant voting rights to women in 1838 were the Pitcairn Islands, followed in 1856 by the Norfolk Islands. If you think about it, among the women who voted there were descendants of Fletcher Christian and the crew of the Bounty. Nearly 80 years after Marion Shimmin was elected to the House of Keys, Claire Christian, of course, became the first woman to hold the office of President of Tynwald. In our last general election, in 2016, 5 women were elected to the Keys. Kate Beecroft, Claire Betterson, Daphne Kane, Anne Corlett, and Julie Edge. And this year, Jane Poole Wilson was elected to the Legislative Council. Our representation in the Court of Tynwald today is not as equitable as in the New Zealand Parliament. Women make up 21% of the Keys, but if you take the Keys and the Council together, it's only 17.1%. In Wellington, 46 women make up 38.4% of the New Zealand Parliament. So we will have to wait and see what happens in 2021. The leaseholders' sheeding vote in 1700, the Electoral Reform Acts here of 1866, 1881, 1892 and 1908, and the extension of the franchise here to 16 and 17-year-olds in 2006 are pioneering stages in this remarkable story of the constitution and governance of the Isle of Man, from its roots in the Norse heritage in 979, when, according to tradition, all the islanders, men and women, gathered to take part in the first Tynwald.